Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's food safety webinar. We'll be talking today about food safety in small-scale processing, focusing on good manufacturing practices and preparing for the Food Safety Modernization Act. My name is Colette D. Phelps. I'm with University of Idaho Extension, and I will be your facilitator today. Our speaker is Josh Bevan, who is the director of the Food Technology Center at the University of Idaho. Before we jump into the content of our webinar, I want to thank our sponsors, University of Idaho Extension, Washington State University Extension, Cooperative Extension Service of University of Alaska Fairbanks, and Oregon State University. This webinar and our food safety series is funded by a USDA NIFA grant, which is the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. With that, I'd like to go ahead and go over some webinar tips. It could be helpful to you to close the other programs running on your computer to be able to put all of your bandwidth into the webinar. If you are having any problems with sound, it could be clarity, speed, you can switch to the phone. There is a call-in number that is in your welcome email. If you do switch to the phone, please mute your computer so you don't get any feedback. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's a bar that has both a Q&A box and a chat box. If you have any issues with technology, please go ahead and type into the chat box. I will be monitoring that throughout the webinar and can get back to you and help you with any problems you might have. Anytime during the webinar, you can type a question in for Josh in the Q&A box. And at the end of his presentation, we will have some time to go through those questions. Handouts from this webinar, so all the information on all of the slides, is going to be available to you on our pnwfoodsafety.org website, so you don't need to write any of that information down. Those handouts will be available by tomorrow afternoon, as will a recording of this webinar. With that, thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to hand it over to Josh.
Hi everyone, I just had trouble finding my mute button, but we are going to be covering good manufacturing practices today. You might also see this as, or have seen this as current good manufacturing practices. So you'd see a small c and GMPs to follow, pretty much the same thing, right? They're federal regulations that apply to all facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold FDA-regulated food. FSPCA is Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance, and I'll be referencing them to a certain degree throughout this webinar. GMPs are essentially working to ensure you're making food under sanitary conditions, so think of a manufacturing environment, and I really consider them the foundation of a food safety system. You see a picture of pyramids to the right of this slide, so think of them, the bigger the foundation, the higher the peak, I like to say. Now we're going to cover some definitions, prerequisite program or procedures, including good manufacturing practices that provide the basic environmental and operating conditions necessary to support the food safety plan. So other prerequisite programs might include an allergen control program or a pest control program, and we'll get to that a little later in the presentation. A food safety system is the outcome of implementing the food safety plan and its supporting elements. So again, GMPs is the foundation and building on that foundation to create an entire food safety system. Now this is a regulation from 21 CFR Part 117. Now if any of you have ever toured a food plant or a food manufacturing facility, you might see them covering a bunch of different things that they disclose to people that are visiting that facility. But this is generally what these current good manufacturing practices cover, which is personnel, how these people act within the facility, what the plants and grounds of the facility are like, the sanitary operations, how your facility is designed and the control of that facility, equipment and utensils, processes and controls, warehousing and distribution, holding and distribution of human byproducts for use as animal food. We won't really be getting into that too much today. That's actually preventive controls for animal feed, but we will discuss it a little bit. And then defect action levels if you have an issue with the food product you're producing. A lot of facilities will cover personnel and how do they control personnel and the environment in which they're working. Normally, you'll see this as a sign-off sheet for personnel, and they will cover training in this particular area. But there's no eating, drinking, or tobacco use in assigned areas. Personal items would be stored away from the production areas, so a lot of facilities will have a locker room of sorts that people can put their personal belongings in. Fun factoid is a lot of German cockroaches are actually introduced via personnel in manufacturing facilities. So it is important that you control where people put their personal items, suitable gloves if they're used in the facility, and how do you control illness? If someone is sick or not feeling well that day, then they should not be manufacturing a food product. Another foundational piece in your kit is hand washing. A lot of people don't hand wash appropriately. Hand wash less than 15 seconds, which is not, that is not enough to effectively clean your hands. What's their personal hygiene like? The garments they're wearing, are they ripped and torn or in good repair? Jewelry can fall off and into the food product. Believe it or not that long ago, I believe it was General Mills, someone lost a diamond earring and it was found in a box of cereal. Luckily, that person got their earring back, but it is an issue. So no jewelry in a plant. In the past, you could wear a wedding band as long as it was smooth and had no jewels in it. And it's really plant specific as to whether or not they will allow that. And of course, proper hair restraints, which hair nets typically cover over the ear. And if a male has facial hair, they will cover that with a beard net. So these are just basic requirements for personnel. Now, covering some definitions again, we've got direct contamination, which is the transfer of human pathogens after using the restroom, for example. Cross-contamination, which is the unintentional transfer of a pathogen from a food or surface to another food or surface. And allergen cross-contact, unintentional incorporation of a food allergen into a food. Now, this is a very common reason for recalls in our food supply today. I don't know, and I obviously can't have a conversation with you in this medium, but a lot of people do have food allergies, and it's a big issue. Now, obviously, infected hands are a source of contamination. One example would be the issue that who was it? One of the burrito manufacturers, the name escapes me right now. Norovirus was a big outbreak in a restaurant facility. But proper hand washing actually reduces the number of people who get sick with diarrhea by 23 to 40%. It reduces the number of colds in the general population by 16 to 21%. And the average person has about 150 different species of bacteria on their hands. So you can imagine the importance of proper hand washing in a food manufacturing environment. Now let's talk a little bit about plants and grounds. They should be free of debris and unused equipment. For those of you unfamiliar with a larger manufacturing facility, a lot of them have what is called a boneyard outside, where they will have equipment that is not in use or no longer basically waiting to be thrown out, but they will have it staged somewhere on the exterior of the facility, and that could be a place of harborage for insects and rodents. If you don't have proper drainage, you can end up with some issues in terms of insects around your facility. Vegetation control, depending on the shrubbery or the landscaping around your facility, does that provide habitat for rodents or insects? And how is that plant designed? Is it designed so that food can be produced in a sanitary manner? Another issue is glass and brittle plastics control. Depending on what you're producing in that facility, glass could be of a great concern, as can brittle plastics. Many facilities that have, let's say, lights above, which most do, they have the appropriate coverings on their lighting. If they have anything made of plastic, they might have that on a checklist to inspect periodically to make sure that it's intact and sound, because if it is broken, where did that broken piece go? Proper ventilation is another one, where they will have a positive airflow supply. Again, depends on the facility. Is the facility designed to prevent cross-contamination, meaning there's a raw area and a finished good area, and there's a limit or a control as to how people and products pass between those two areas? Another issue is preventing allergen cross-contact. Do you have a designated area to control your allergens? How do you produce product if you have allergen-containing materials and non-allergen-containing materials? So these are all the things that facilities need to think about when they're building a facility, retooling, or remodeling of a facility. And this is just one example. The picture's a little blurry on my end. I don't know how it looks on yours, but basically it's an area that does not have proper drainage, and it is a potential source of contamination and breeding ground for pests. So this is something that a facility would want to avoid at all costs, because eventually that could get into and contaminate the interior of the facility, especially if you have workers going outside for any reason. Now, sanitary operations. The plant needs to be maintained and in good repair. You have to have food grade cleaners and sanitizers. You need proper chemical storage. How are those chemicals stored? Typically, they're in a locked cabinet or a locked maintenance closet that is controlled, so people can't just go in there and access chemicals, and they're only accessed by people that are trained to use them. Food contact surfaces are cleaned and sanitized before use and after interruptions, and non-food contact surfaces cleaned as necessary, whether that be the walls or floors in an operation. So food contact surfaces, I think a lot of you are familiar with stainless steel, which is what you commonly see in a food manufacturing or restaurant facility. The surface really does need to be smooth and cleanable. If a surface ends up with dents and scratches, then it might be time to be replaced. It should be cleaned appropriately. They use terminology like that because it really does depend on the product you're producing. It should be sanitized after the fact, and you need to prevent allergen cross-contact and cross-contamination of food products. One thing you could think about is the color coding of cutting boards. That is one method for controlling raw versus finished product. in preparation, or even in some cases they have color coding for specific allergens. Now here's an example of improper storage of chemicals. We've got a bottle of Comet sitting in the corner next to what appears to be some sugar mix at a bakery. So we've got somebody that's weighed up, you know, a bakery mix, and it's right next to Comet. And I would hope that the Comet is not mixed in whatever's about to be baked, but that is not how things should be stored. Now this gentleman's got the best of intentions. He's got an apron that he's laying on the floor to clean, but he could also be unintentionally contaminating it, because you can see, number one, it is on the floor, and number two, it is sitting over a drain, and drains can obviously be very much a source of contamination. So this would be a no-no. Now, what about sanitary facilities and controls? Number one, you need to have a potable water supply. Now, I'm not saying that couldn't potentially be a well, as long as that well is tested at appropriate intervals, and you know that water is in good condition and capable of being used for consumption. The facility needs proper plumbing, which includes floor drainage and backflow prevention. Backflow prevention is typically inspected on an annual basis in most facilities, because you don't want obviously sewage water or black water coming back up into your water supply. Sanitary toilet facilities, extremely important. You want to make sure your workers have an appropriate area in which to go to the bathroom and wash their hands. Hand washing facilities as appropriate. Typically, that would be a dedicated sink or a dedicated area where people can wash their hands in an acceptable manner before they start manufacturing a food product. Proper methods for trash disposal. Do the trash cans have covers on them to prevent cross-contact or cross-contamination? And is the trash promptly removed after it's generated from the facility so as to not contaminate the food product you're producing? Now, admittedly, this example is a bit extreme, I hope anyway, but a soiled toilet may contain bacterial and viral pathogens that can aerosolize when the toilet is flushed. So again, you want to make sure that your toilet facilities are adequate and good repair. This is obviously not a good example of something that is clean and in good repair. This is just an example of a hand washing station, but there are a variety of options out there. There are knee, I don't know if anyone here has seen them, but there's knee, sensor, or foot activated hand washing stations. This particular one looks like it's a sensor operated station. You've got a soap dispenser, a sanitizer dispenser, a towel dispenser, and as you can see on the sink, this one actually has a spot for a nail scrubber. But as you can imagine, this sink should also be dedicated to nothing but hand washing. You should not be cleaning salad in your hand washing sink. Now, as far as equipment and utensils are concerned, they should be cleanable and maintained, and they should be for food contact and non-food contact areas. For example, the facility that I oversee, we actually have white brushes and white scrubbies for food contact surfaces, and the color black, for example, is strictly for floor drains. Red is for non-food contact surfaces. You should have appropriate food contact surfaces, i.e. no wood. A generally stainless steel or another cleanable surface is appropriate. If you manufacture product using compressed gas, think of air. We do actually have some equipment here that operates with air, but it doesn't really impact the food product, but the air should be filtered if it's being used in some fashion. You should make sure the temperature if you've got coolers and freezers, you're monitoring the temperature, especially if refrigeration or freezing is a method of preservation or a food safety concern for the product you're producing. And you should make sure that your process control equipment is maintained. And what do I mean by process control equipment? Well, that could be, for example, a pH meter, if that's something you're using, a thermometer. These should all be calibrated and maintained in good repair, because if it's not working properly, it's giving you bad data and it's useless. So in terms of processes and controls, you should always have a quality control system in place, some method of inspecting both the products you're bringing in, the products you're manufacturing, the products you're shipping, and the facility as a whole. Sanitation should be conducted by trained personnel, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of training personnel, especially if you're bringing temp help into your facility. They need to understand the rules by which they need to process your food products. But sanitation is using chemicals, essentially, right? Whether they be a cleaning chemical, that is a foaming detergent, or a sanitizer following cleaning. And it's important that they know how to properly mix those chemicals at the right dilution rates and use them so they don't contaminate the food product or the facility. Raw materials and ingredient control. I mean, this doesn't need to be a big deal, especially with these small processors, but make sure, for example, your packaging, the product, the raw material you purchased is intact. It doesn't look compromised in any fashion. You might get a certificate of analysis with it, or make sure the ingredient deck is appropriate. And you've got appropriate manufacturing operations. So those are just some methods of processes and controls, and we're going to bump into raw materials here. So the food that you're manufacturing needs to be, the raw material you're putting into it needs to be FDA compliant, right? So it needs to be suitable for consumption. And a lot of small manufacturers might be buying raw materials from Costco or some other large store or some wholesaler. So generally speaking, they're FDA compliant, but you never know with some folks. They might be using something that is from another country, which becomes another issue altogether. And you just need to make sure that the raw materials you're using are fit for consumption. They need to be properly inspected. I mentioned that on the previous slide. You know, just make sure it's intact. It's what it says it is. And you should store them appropriately. So if it requires refrigeration, you should store that product in a refrigerated manner. If it can be stored ambiently, that's fine too. But just make sure you store your raw materials appropriately. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with rework, but sometimes there can be a mix-up where you have improperly mixed, a formula. Well, that could be salvageable into another baked mix if we're talking about baking a product, but you just need to make sure that you properly identify rework so you prevent contaminating another product. Or you realize it went into a wrong container. Let's say you dumped something into a container, it wasn't appropriate, it was mislabeled. You might be able to rework that and put it into another container. But make sure that you properly identify it so it doesn't get mixed up with with other stuff. Now, in terms of manufacturing processes and controls, you might have microbial control through heating and time temp control, pH, etc. You know, a kill step for your particular product. If we were thinking about, let's say, something simple like salsa. I mean, salsa, let's say, for example, you need to heat it to 190 degrees for 30 seconds. Well, there's your time temp control, and you need to have it, the pH needs to be 4.2 or under for your particular salsa. So those are two methods of control while you're manufacturing that product. You need to make sure you're using sanitary equipment, utensils, and containers. So what would that be? You know, they have obviously stainless steel whisks or stainless steel paddles, but they could also be plastic. They actually have metal detectable plastic implements out there. So as we all know, plastic can get scratched or a piece can fall off. And if your facility has a metal detector, it might be able to pick up that impregnated plastic. Now, a lot of us don't have that. So as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, what you might want to consider if you're dealing with, say, large plastic paddles, that you have a check, a quality assurance or a quality control check on that sanitary equipment where you're making sure nothing has chipped off before the start of processing or at the end of the day when processing is completed. That way you can ensure there is no plastic in your product. Now, not many of us that I'm aware are producing with ice, but if you are using ice in your facility, ice production should be from potable water. And when you are manufacturing and you do have allergens, you need to make sure that you are preventing any potential allergen cross contact and making sure that people aren't moving from a raw side to a finished side effectively or potentially contaminating the product. And one example of that could be, you know, if you are making, let's say, gluten-free cookies, but you also have a normal wheat cookie, then you might want to consider producing the allergen-free or the gluten-free cookie the first part of the day and then finish up with your wheat cookie in the afternoon. It makes it a lot more challenging if you start with the wheat-based cookie and then finish with a gluten-free. You incidentally increase the risk of allergen cross contact in doing something like that. So that would be a manufacturing consideration. Now let's talk a little bit about warehousing and distribution. As you can see in these two pictures, we've got wrapped pallets in the picture down to the bottom right, and there's some spacing between these rows of pallets. That makes it easy to inspect down between the rows of pallets and potentially clean. It's a little tight, but that's often the case in a food manufacturing facility. Typically in a warehousing situation, you also want to maintain a distance of at least 2 feet from a wall to a pallet so you can safely inspect behind it. You also, especially for rodent control, but these things appear in this picture to be adequately wrapped and protected. And let's talk a little bit about trucking or distribution. How is your product being distributed? Does it require a refrigerated truck? A lot of people, especially smaller producers, are going on what is called an LTL carrier. So let's say they're only shipping 1 pallet of product. Well, you've got to be aware of what else that truck is transporting, because it could potentially put your product at risk. But you need to make sure that your product is going to make it safely to the other side or to wherever it's going. And these are all things to take into consideration when you're either starting out with a little food manufacturing facility. How are you going to store the product? How are you going to ship the product? And you want to make sure, obviously, that end customer is happy with the product they've received. Now, this is an interesting development in recent years, and I mentioned it at the start of the webinar, but animal feed requirements. I don't know how many of you have a waste stream and would like to make sure that just doesn't go into, the landfill, because there are a lot of larger producers that are taking defect food products and they go to animal feed. But the food must comply with GMPs during holding and distribution. To keep it simple, animal feed requirements are very similar to human food requirements at this point. And you need to make sure that this product is, it is not contaminated or potentially contaminated with waste. And you put the product in containers that are properly identified. This is an animal feed product. And the regulation is down below, preventive controls for animal feed, 21 CFR Part 507. And one interesting example of, say, an animal feed requirement would be bird seed. A new development is that bird seed, as you might imagine if anyone's ever purchased, say, bulk sunflower seed to feed birds, they now need to be free from the pathogen Salmonella. And you'd think, well, why would that be? It doesn't seem to impact the birds at all, but it does impact the people feeding the birds. And a lot of bird feeding is a popular pastime with the elderly population. The elderly population, because they're elderly, might have a slightly compromised immune system. And let's say, for example, they reach into their bag of sunflower seed, fill up their bird feeder, and go back into the house and don't adequately wash their hands. They could make themselves sick. So that was just a side note on animal feed. Now, what are defect action levels? I think a lot of you are probably aware that we all consume a certain number of insect parts on an annual basis because it's in these raw commodities, or I should say, minimally processed products, even like flour. There are an allowable number of insect parts found in just basic wheat flour and other flours and starches. But it's a level of non-hazardous, naturally occurring, unavoidable defect at which FDA may regard a food product adulterated subject to enforcement action under Section 402A3 of the Federal Drug and Cosmetic Act. Now, they do have established maximum levels for naturally occurring defects, like the insect parts that I just mentioned. But you need to make an effort to reduce the defects to the lowest level feasible. Another example would be if any of you consume, say, prunes or dates, something that says may contain pits, right? That it's pretty much impossible for a manufacturer to get every last little pit fragment out of some of these food products. So there is an acceptable level of quote unquote contamination in those products per the FDA. Now, we mentioned other prerequisite programs, right? Continue to think about good manufacturing practices as the foundation for your food safety system or food safety program, but there are also other things that go along with it, right? Or could go along with it depending on the product you're producing. And one might be hygienic zoning. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. And preventive maintenance, right? How are you maintaining the equipment that's producing the product? And label review. This might not be as big a deal for smaller producers, but larger manufacturers that are producing multiple different items, it can be a very critical component to their operation, making sure the right label is getting on the right jar or the right package. So that's why we say down below, some things can be plant specific. If you are running an allergen-free facility or a gluten-free facility, you might actually have an allergen program that's pretty stringent. You call your prerequisite program, and if anybody's familiar with the Food Safety Modernization Act, you could actually elevate an allergen program to a preventive control, but that's another discussion for another time. Here's an example of hygienic zoning, right? You've got an area where you've got packed raw materials, you've received the product in, it's safe, right? All the packaging sound, so basic hygiene's needed. Now you're weighing out ingredients in the medium hygiene area, right? You're getting your product ready for baking or hot filling or whatever it is you're producing. Then you've got the actual action area, right, where it's critical that everything be as clean and as sanitary as possible. So that would be your hygiene, high hygiene area. You want to make sure everybody's, got their hair nets on, got their beard nets on, doesn't have jewelry in, because think about it, this is where the product's potentially exposed. If someone's wearing earrings, not that I would say that it's acceptable in your facility, but back in the packed raw materials area, it's pretty hard to contaminate a product with a ring or an earring. But in your high hygiene area, that's certainly an issue. We're focused on keeping a sanitary environment. You've cooked your product or baked your product, and you've packaged it, and now it's staged in your warehouse for shipping. So you've gone back to the basic hygiene. And then you've got your non-food production areas, which, that could be office space or some other thing. So that's just an example of what you might see in a food facility for hygienic zoning if they deem that to be a really important issue. Now, preventive maintenance is something that is really important, right? I mean, if you have delayed maintenance, it can cause contamination in your food plant or your food manufacturing facility. One example that I could provide you is that many years ago, I worked at a dairy, and as you can guess, at a dairy, there's a lot of stainless steel piping. Well, we had a problem with total coliform counts in finished pasteurized milk, and we could not, for the life of us, figure out what was going on. The raw milk was going through a pasteurizer, through these pipes, and into a filling head. Well, it turned out that one silo with milk had a piping coming off of that silo, going through some insulation, and there was a connection with a seal that was hidden from everyone's view, and that seal had slowly deteriorated, compromising the connection between those two pipes and allowed bacteria to grow in that connection. So that would be one example of, well, where preventive maintenance wasn't performed, right? But you want to make sure that your equipment is maintained and sound and isn't contaminating your food product. This is just another example of, a prerequisite program, in this case, label review. Are your nutrition facts present or not? Is there a statement of identity? Do you have the net content, the serving size? You get the idea. But this is just another tool in your toolkit to make sure you are manufacturing a safe food product. Another one could be pest control. All facilities, independent facilities, do have pest control. Most of the time it's farmed out to a third party. So number one, you've got someone licensed to apply pesticide if that's necessary, and they can just go and check your traps on their own. And that might be insect light traps on the interior of the facility. That could be bait stations on the exterior of the facility because you do not want any rodenticide inside your facility. And then they've got live traps on the interior of the facility. Now, in terms of our summary, number one, good manufacturing practices are required per the regulation. And what's it doing? It's helping us ensure the production of safe and wholesome food. I mean, that's ultimately what we all want if we're manufacturing a food product, because it's not really a good idea, tongue-in-cheek, if you kill your customers, it doesn't get you very far, but you really want to ensure that you are manufacturing a safe and wholesome food product. And I would think that anyone that's joined in this webinar today, they're proud of the products that they're manufacturing, and they want to make sure those people on the other end are enjoying them and they're also safe. Not only do they taste good, but they're safe. And I can never, ever, ever underemphasize training. Training is required to effectively understand and implement GMPs. Common sense isn't always so common, and it means a lot to your employees or part-time help. Even if you just sit them down for 5 to 10 minutes and go over what is expected of them in a clear and defined way, whether it be a quick hand washing lesson, how to properly apply your hairnet, and you know, you're proud of your food product, make sure they are producing it in a safe manner. And I'm going to unmute myself now because I whipped through that pretty quickly, if I can figure out how to unmute myself.
So you're not muted.
Yeah, that's because you heard me.
I have unmuted myself. So thank you for that great presentation. Right now we don't have any questions, so if you do have questions, go ahead and put them in the question and answer box. And while I'm giving you an opportunity to ask questions, I have one of my own. Where would you recommend that people go to find out about trainings?
If they're in the state of Idaho, the Idaho State Department of Health and Welfare has a great website that has a list of trainings on there. The University of Idaho Food Tech Center, not to stump my own place, but we offer training at least 3 times a year. That it's called Developing Your Food Product Idea, where we cover in very broad brushstrokes food safety, product development, and business development.
Great, and they would find that by going to the University of Idaho's website and searching Food Technology Center?
Yes, that is correct.
Great. And I think that they can probably go to other states with their Department of Health and Welfare equivalent is to look for educational programs, and then also the universities that are co-sponsoring this webinar series.
Correct. And Oregon State University actually has a food innovation center that will help you develop a food product and obviously produce it in a safe manner.
Great, thank you. Well, we didn't have any questions from today's webinar. I really appreciate your presenting today, Josh, and thank you for all the folks that joined us live. Again, this webinar will be recorded and posted at this website, www.pacificnorthwestfoodsafety.org. Our next webinar is going to be on July 9th, and it's going to cover how do you develop a food safety plan for your small scale processing enterprise. So we hope to see you on July 9th. Again, we'll be posting the slide deck and a recording of this webinar by tomorrow afternoon. We appreciate your joining us and have a great day. Thank you again, Josh.
Thanks.